is wrong.
Okay, we've all arrived. Welcome back, everyone. My name is Daniel London. I'm a doctoral candidate in history at New York University and a Jefferson Scholar at the Hagley Library. It's my pleasure to introduce the next panel on politics and inequality. The creation and operation of markets, the distribution of their benefits and costs across populations, their legitimization or delegitimization, all of these dynamics are fundamentally shaped by governance structures, state institutions, and public policies. Balancing change and stasis, laws of motion, and contingency is always a challenge in any account of political economy, particularly one that stretches across a century. But it is a challenge that's taken up by our panelists, who will investigate the political dimensions of crisis and inequality, both in the late industrial era and our own time. Going from left to right, our moderator, Julia Ott, is Associate Professor of History at the New School and the author of When Wall Street Met Main Street, The Quest for an Investor's Democracy, winner of the 2011 Vincent DeSantis Prize for the best book on the Gilded Age and Progressive Era. Her work has been featured in the New York Times and Business World, and she is co-editor of Columbia University's Press's series on the history of U.S. capitalism and a distinguished lecturer for the Organization of American Historians. Thomas Ferguson is Professor Emeritus at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, Senior Fellow at Better Markets, and Director of Research Projects at the Institute for New Economic Thinking. He is the author or co-author of several books, including Golden Rule and Right Turn. His articles have been published in many scholarly journals, including the Quarterly Journal of Economics, International Organization, International Studies Quarterly, and the Journal of Economic History. And he is also a member of the editorial board of the International Journal of Political Economy. Kay Schlossman is Endowed Professor of Political Science at Boston College and co-author of The Unheavenly Chorus, Unequal Political Voice and the Broken Promise of American Democracy. She is the author of multiple other books as well, including The Private Roots of Public Action, Gender, Equality, and Political Participation, Voice Inequality, Civic Voluntarism in American Politics, Organized Interest in American Democracy, and Injury to Insult, Unemployment, Class, and Political Response. She is also winner of numerous awards and chair of the American Political Science Association section on elections, public opinion, and voting behavior, and is also a fellow at the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Kim Phillips-Fein is an associate professor at New York University, where she teaches American political, business, and labor history. She is the author of Invisible Hands, The Making of the Conservative Movement from the New Deal to Reagan, and Fear City, New York's Fiscal Crises and the Rise of Austerity Politics, which is a Pulitzer finalist. Kimberly S. Johnson is Professor of Social and Cultural Analysis at New York University as well, where her research focuses on the intersections between American political development, urban and metropolitan politics, federalism and intergovernmental relations, race and ethnic politics, bureaucracy, and public policy. She is the author of Reforming Jim Crow, Southern Politics and State in the Age Before Brown, and Governing the American State, Congress and the New Federalism, 1877 to 1929. And finally, we have Jeffrey Broxmeyer, who is Assistant Professor of Political Science and Public Administration at the University of Toledo, where his current research explores office-holding practices in U.S. political development with a focus on wealth accumulation by party leaders during the late 19th century. His first book, Electoral Capitalism, The Party System in New York's Gilded Age, the first one, I assume, is under contract with the University of Pennsylvania Press. Please welcome me in welcoming our panel.
Hi, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for attending. Thank you for that lovely introduction, and thank you to all those who are involved in organizing a wonderful conference. Eager to get started. So what I love about this panel is that even as we are comparing the political sources of inequality, we are, the introduction that we just had and the materials that have been circulated, we're already problematizing that boundary between the economy and the market, or between government and capitalism. And this, of course, is very important for a wide variety of reasons, including in shaping, our own thinking about how to address equality today and where it comes from. But also it's interesting to me as a historian, because it seems to me that in the Gilded Age, a lot of very important and long-lived, influential, long-term influential thinking happened about this very problem, about obscuring the interconnectedness of the economic and the political, or even creating that sense of boundary between this sphere of markets, at once all-powerful yet fragile, and then the sphere of politics. And the economy is something that is apolitical, something that is technical, and outside of the bounds of the political. And of course, this is something that social movements are very much challenging in the period. So it's lovely to return to these questions, even as we develop our historical perspective on the political source of inequality in the last and current Gilded Age. So taking that as my starting point, let me begin with this question for our panelists. How did the American political system of the Gilded Age and state policy in the United States contribute to inequality, broadly speaking, however you'd like to define that, during that first Gilded Age of the late 19th century and versus today in our so-called second Gilded Age? Or if you wanted to flip the question, we could ask, how does economic equality create or amplify political inequality back then and now? And here I'll just ask everybody to share a little bit about their thinking, and then maybe we can drill down based upon people's areas of expertise as the conversation progresses.
Okay, I've got a PowerPoint. I'm not trying to go first. I just can't talk without it.
Oh, okay.
Great.
Go for it.
Go for it.
All right. I've got to be able to access it up there because it's my whole talk. What's that?
Well, maybe while Tom is setting up.
Oh, should I take
yeah,
a crack
go
at that?
ahead.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm a political scientist, and I'm learning a lot about the real Gilded Age at this conference, and less capable of talking about the comparisons. I do know, however, that as a general proposition among wealthy democracies, the United States makes it easier to translate economic resources into political power than in a lot of other places we compare ourselves to. And that historically that has ebbed and flowed, and that two periods where it was relatively easier so to do were the first Gilded Age and now. But there's some pretty important differences between how economic wherewithal could be translated into political power between the two eras. And one of them is quite simply that what we call dishonest graft or real corruption that involves suitcases of money was much more common during the first Gilded Age, as was genuine corruption in voting. In the new Gilded Age, the kind of corruption we have that's analogous to using money to get political outcomes is legal. And in fact, one of the ways that we've had an important development recently is that the legality of the use of market resources to influence policy has gotten constitutional imprimatur from the Supreme Court in a series of decisions. When Citizens United, a well-known decision, was made now almost a decade ago, everyone was worried about the definition of corporations as human beings, as people. And in one of my very rare prescient moments said, don't worry about that as much as the definition of money as speech. And that has really changed in a sense, the level playing field of who can have multiple forms of voting. and that the fact that it has constitutional protection means that ordinary legislative means of addressing that inequality are sort of out of bounds. More generally, I want to say that in our current era, the relationship between market power and political voice, what government hears from citizens, are mixed in very complicated ways. There are forms by which citizens have the ability to make their wishes known that are related to cash, and one of them obviously is campaign contributions. Another one is lobbying. It's not that our lobbying involves, the kinds of things we saw in the Teapot Dome scandal, again, with, suitcases of money. It's that lobbying is a very professionalized activity where organizations, the majority of which do not have ordinary people as members. They're corporations, universities, museums, all kinds of institutions. But they hire professionals, lawyers, public relations people, researchers, and so forth, to make their case. And because it's a professionalized domain, the amount of resources you have to devote implies the amount of speech that you have. In addition, we have a whole bunch of ways of telling the government what's on our minds by writing or emailing our public officials, by working in campaigns, by going to protests, and so forth. And it turns out that the best predictor of all that kind of political activity is education. But as we know, education and income are strongly related. And so even though income itself, in a kind of causal mechanism, is not related to the amount you talk or the number of messages you send, it turns out that the strong educational gradient that is related to political participation means that there is also an income gradient from whom the government hears. And the government hears very, very little from people who are economically disadvantaged, with similar implications for what it hears from, for example, African Americans or Latinos. So the intermingling in the current era of market resources and political voice is complicated, but it is not a level playing field.
Yeah, go ahead.
Can I just jump into the conversation, particularly about political corruption, because it seems to be one of the things that, has typically defined the Gilded Age, and this question about, to what extent we can compare across periods on the question of political corruption. There is a huge financialization of the party system that takes place in the first Gilded Age. And, there's this question that kind of percolates up throughout the 1870s and the 1880s and 1890s. It's the degree to which, there's an unease about the kind of political practices that people kind of have a sense of what's going on, but really a lot of it's behind closed doors, the proverbial smoking room, and, it's not clear if money is changing hands and things like that. But the framing of, whether or not the first Gilded Age was corrupt and whether or not we can compare that to whether there's corruption going, in the contemporary period, it's very, very problematic, I think, because people's definition of what corruption is just all over the place, right? Some practices are technically legal, but political opponents call them corrupt because they disagree with them, right? It ends up being this kind of catch-all for whatever political group feels is improper, basically. So a lot of the, quote-unquote Gilded Age political corruption ends up really being that certain people think that the wrong kinds of people are in power, basically, right? So I think a much better framing for this would be, or I would suggest an alternative framing, and that is that in the first Gilded Age in particular, you see that there's this process of what I would call electoral capitalism. That is to say, the process by which politics begets wealth. And you see that kind of exploding in the first Gilded Age, where you have the creation of really, party leaders become very, very wealthy, right? There's a career path that you can kind of get into politics in the Gilded Age, and you can really make a lot of money. And in fact, I would argue that's one of the defining features of what makes a party leader in the Gilded Age. So, you know, the extent to which we can set up a comparison between the first Gilded Age and the second Gilded Age, on that, I would argue actually you can see pieces of, right? It's a little difficult to get the whole view because most information is not public, I think, in kind of the contemporary age where there's all sorts of dark money moving around and things like that. But I think we can see that there are some large political fortunes that have been created in the current period too. I think that is a point of comparison that we could talk more about.
Kimberly Johnson.
So I thought maybe starting with corruption is an interesting start given what happened, I think it was 2 weeks ago when the admissions scandal erupted, right? So how is it that giving a building is not corrupt, but giving $1 million to the women's soccer coach at Yale is corrupt, right? So I'm wondering if we can maybe even step back a bit further from inequality or political inequality, thinking about political inequality or economic inequality as separate, and maybe thinking about a broader question about political inequality for whom, right? Or economic inequality for whom. And maybe also reframing it as a question of, is it a battle over inequality, a struggle over inequality, or is it a struggle over opportunity, right? So I think that perhaps fits with I think both of these comments, which is, how do we define this moment that we're in today, as well as in the past? Is it simply these different markers of corruption, or is it really a struggle over opportunity?
Right.
And that, I think, is probably one of the things that I'm grappling with, is that I don't think you can separate the two, right. That political opportunity and economic opportunity and who gets what, the sort of core of politics, right. Is really driving force in both of these eras.
I love the way this conversation is developing, and so I'm kind of scared to step in and mess it up. But a couple things that have popped up so far that I just wanted to put a pin in at least. I love this idea of this. I like how the conversation around corruption is developing, and you're talking about, Kimberly's talking about the admissions scandal, and we don't know, you know, some things we recognize as corruption and some things that we don't. And Jeff very helpfully put out the point that, you know, we use these terms like dark money rather than saying corruption. We say corruption for, you know, certain folks who use their monetary resources to get their children into school who we might think might not otherwise deserve it, but other things we, you know, maybe we don't like them, maybe we question them, but the word corruption doesn't necessarily come into that consideration. I was actually, yes, and why dark money, why Koch funded, why don't we just say corrupt, you know, why don't we? So there is, I think, in our culture some tolerance for you know, extremely wealthy people, and some default assumption that we're willing to turn a blind eye or not critique quite as strongly because we buy the idea that, you know, perhaps there are some trickle-down effects for the rest of us, in a way that we don't entertain that possibility in other cases. And that strikes to me as being like an interesting historical story there, American attitudes towards wealth and large wealth as being fundamentally corrupt or not. The other thing that I wanted to go back to is this question of the translation between economic and market power, and, you know, reiterate the point that Kay was making about its power, its voice, its voting, its policy, that there's so many different dimensions to that. Now, lastly, returning to the point that was just made about opportunity. So corruption is a word that I don't feel that we hear too much today. Other Gilded Age terms that talked about the opportunity, I think, is more familiar to us, and more recently, in our political discourse, but our corruption sounds a little bit old-fashioned, a little bit first Gilded Agey. But then there are other terms that I think have come back into our political discourse in recent years, like socialism and like monopoly. Not, apart from the game board, not words I think that we've been hearing a lot in our political discourse in recent decades, but hearing a lot in recent years. So these terms, monopoly and socialism, have returned. Other terms like corruption have not. What do you think it says about, how do you interpret the resurgence of some of these terms and not other? Do they signal the same things now that they did back then? What does it say about our contemporary moment that some terms that were used in progressive critiques of Gilded Age or reformist critiques of Gilded Age political economy are perhaps coming back into play today?
It's all yours.
Well, I guess, I'm not sure why people are looking at me exactly, but I think, right, well, I think, I guess, so a couple of different thoughts. One is that so in this whole conversation, in the whole framing of the day, I think I have been asking myself a lot, what are the similarities and what are the differences between these two Gilded Ages? And I think there's a part of me that resists thinking of this, or resists kind of overemphasizing the similarities and connections, and wants to kind of call attention to the differences. So maybe we can spend time with that too. But in thinking about it, one of the things that does seem similar is I think there is this very strong the emergence of an elite framework that really articulates inequality as a positive good and argues that high levels of economic inequality are inevitable, necessary, positive, and not only unavoidable, but the way that things ought to be, normatively the best. And I think in the late 19th century, you see this in different iterations of the social Darwinist framework, and today you see it in kind of certain strands of free market thought and an embrace of ideas about meritocracy. And I think an argument that in some ways runs very counter to the dominant American political tradition, or ideas about democracy and equality, but instead really a counter-political tradition that asserts that hierarchy is actually for the best. And I think the emergence of this in these two periods is a striking, and the way in which it kind of filters down into sort of popular assumptions and ideas is both troubling and is troubling, frightening, and also one of the things that really links the two moments. And it may be that the adoption, I think there are a lot of reasons why a framework of socialism, or it's interesting, I was thinking monopoly, how much is that as kind of, in what ways is monopoly part of the political conversation? Maybe around tech companies, but I think there are a lot of reasons why ideas about socialism are coming back. The language of socialism feels available now to critics of the social order in a way that it didn't 20 or 30 or 40 years ago. But maybe it is, there's a desire to challenge, as the early socialists did, the extremely undemocratic ideology of the elite, and to argue that a kind of that economic participation is necessarily part of political life, and that political democracy demands some kind of economic, is not just a formal question, but involves one's relationship to the whole society and economic position. So I think there are a lot of reasons for the resurgence of that language, but maybe something, that was such a preoccupation of the Debs era socialists, the kind of extreme commitment to democracy, the faith in democracy, the desire to recapture some, kind of a very idealistic attitude towards political participation and the power of ordinary people to kind of control the state in their own interests. And I think kind of reaching for that against this kind of this assertion of the positive good of hierarchy is maybe part of the reason for its coming back.
I mean, I think I would maybe add that I think one of the things that is striking to me about this new era is that in some ways it starts with this assertion of Tina, right? There's no alternative. Then also this notion of the end of history. And so I think it's not surprising that in this moment where it was proclaimed that it's the end of history and we sort of are figuring out, well, maybe it's actually not working out so well, that we go back and try to recover something from history that will attempt to help us explain what's going on today. But I think probably one of the issues in politics is that, I think terms are developed to help us understand what's going on and to move forward. And so I think when I think of the use of socialism or monopoly, I think these are useful terms that people are using to start to identify problems. Are they the terms that we'll end up with? In 100 years, if we were to ever have, God forbid, a third Gilded Age conference, would it be some other term that we would be looking at?
We wouldn't be here because this would be underwater.
Will we be in a big submarine? We hope.
Too pessimistic. Maybe could I just
Should we
present a few
Yeah,
graphs
that
for a
sounds great,
second?
yeah.
I actually want to
Little
sort of
visual
tie
break.
before we get to complexity, I think we should get to some straightforward factual issues. Let me preface this by saying, if you want to understand the Gilded Age, I think you need to read Larry Goodwin's old book, great old book, Democratic Promise, on the populace. Because there, what Goodwin shows you is that the populace were not progressives. Implicitly, he's giving you a message that quite tallies with, say, Gabriel Kuhl's great old triumph of conservatism. Folks who think populism and progressivism are the same thing are making a big mistake. Now, the reason I want to focus on this is I fear that we could be about to repeat this history. Basically, if you look at the political history of the Gilded Age, which I'm just going to stipulate began somewhere in the 1870s and then dies in 1929, you will find basically the populists challenge a two-party monopoly, and they collapse in 1896. My old MIT colleague, Walter Dean Burnham, I think told this story extremely well, and I have to say I have always agreed with him on the importance of that date. So let me just, what I'd like to do, I want to focus first on what happened in the progressive period, because I am going to suggest you might see this happen again. We can hope not, but, wait. Bottom line is that American voting turnout fell very sharply. I'll give you a graph in a second. And in the South, it collapsed completely. There's the first graph. And the blue one is the national turnout, which includes the Southern, and then there's the Southern turnout. Now, if you look at that, you can see how micro, after roughly 1896, 1900, how turnout collapses. I mean, in the South, it gets ridiculous. You know what voter turnout was in Georgia around 1938? It was about 5 to 7%. Of course.
What's the denominator?
The total eligible electorate.
Okay,
People. Yeah, I'm using the stuff. Burnham has been doing election statistics for years, but he had a lot more. So Burnham and I finally published them in a book about 4 years ago. And those are the statistics that I'm pulling. This is the total eligible electorate, which does include women after the amendment and not before.
Does it exclude African Americans?
No, they're in there.
They've been disenfranchised?
No, they're in there as a denominator.
Okay.
I mean, that's why
Well, that's important.
It is important, but there's nothing new in that. I mean, let
Well,
me
I just wanted to
yeah.
clarify.
Now, okay, yeah, but these are numbers that, none of these numbers are new, although for some of the congressional elections, they are, because people they haven't paid attention to the stuff that Dean put in that second book that I edited with him. Anyway.
I think what she's trying to say is it's new because it accounts for, it's a historical break that accounts for why voting falls
But
off.
here's my point. After 1900, as the progressives start talking about monopoly, reform, all sorts of procedural changes that you think of as good things, right up to and including the U.S. direct election of U.S. senators, voting turnout is falling sharply. It's plunging everywhere. It's capped. I mean, look, I was a Princeton PhD, right? Woodrow Wilson is the guy who sort of combines all of these. But here is it also is, you see this big fall in the Democratic percentage of the electorate. It's basically in the South, it's all there is, but elsewhere, it's not very strong. Now, these are just plain old facts. Now, my point is, yes, sorry, I want to go. What's going on here? I mean, my reading of this, we have good numbers on income distribution. We do not have good numbers on political money for the Gilded Age. But to the extent anybody can sort of recapture those, it's not edifying. But my take is that effectively after 1900, the average human, either white or black, is a point I want to make, is outside the South, when G. Chen and I looked at, there was this famous controversy in political science, what explains the voter turnout decline? In the South, we all know what it was. People put all of the blacks. They also put most of the whites out of the system. They did it with poll taxes, literacy tests, jury requirements, a whole nest of stuff. None of that story is new. On the other hand, what happened to explain that very large, not Southern turnout in the North and the Midwest and the Western states? There, when you do a regression analysis, which after all these years in political science, turned out nobody had actually done, they just sort of heaped abuse on Dean Burnham, you find very clearly that the spread of industrialization, value added in manufacturing per capita, is a major explanatory force. Put bluntly, what Burnham always said was true, and a bunch of other people have sometimes chimed in, the people who, in the later Gilded Age, there was a very clear effort to disenfranchise much of the population. All right, now the question is, as I see talk about socialism, and the socialist vote peaked, my memory is in 1912, around, I think, 6%. I mean, I'm a big admirer of Debs. I have no trouble. I don't think it's just a question of language. It is clear that the sort of the dual character of the American economy, the way the middle class is hollowed out, for most people, it's just not working. And that's happening not just in the peripheral areas where, a lot of the Trump voters were to be found last time in 2016. It's happening in the cities. The cities are likely, I think, the future of socialism in the U.S. When you can elect, 5 socialists in the Chicago City Council? I mean, I would have said 5 years ago, I'd have eaten this microphone if something like that would have happened. But here's my problem. I think the U.S. could recapitulate this history. We know there are abuses. We know there are problems. The populists lost in 1896. They got mashed up, and you got the political system that I just sketched very quickly there. Can it happen again? Well, it basically boils down to, I think it's always a question of cash first and foremost. I do not think anything else is nearly as important. Let me just put 2 graphs here. This is what this graph is effectively the percentage of your funds that come from contributions of a certain size. And if you just look, you can see that, I put Ryan and McConnell on there for laughs, as it were. It's obvious that McConnell is basically getting nothing but large money. I don't think he has any hardly small contributions at all. This was for 2016. And the basic story is you can see Trump and Clinton aren't that far apart. Bernie Sanders essentially gets no large money. This graph, when he declared the other week, was being run around all over the internet because it's true. Now, I should explain that my colleagues and I are much more careful than the people who usually write about this stuff. We actually integrate both the FEC money with the IRS 527 cash and do a bunch of other things, and then we aggregate to try to catch the people who do the same thing. Our numbers on concentrations are therefore always higher. But, I think we have a pretty straightforward thing. Sanders clearly represents something very different. Everybody else is more or less not hugely that different. There are differences. You can read stuff I and my colleagues have written about that on the website of the Institute for New Economic Thinking and elsewhere. But there you have it. I would add, too, that if you do Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi, they look like pretty much like Trump or Clinton in their contributions. And then this problem, we have evidence only going back to 1980, but for every U.S. election we have, you always get a straight line relationship between the percentage of total money and the outcome. Now, there have been suggestions, well, there must be because the money's following the polls. We can rule that out with instrumental variables, but I'm not going to. My point is, that's your challenge. You are living in a second Gilded Age. Money is talking. People know things are miserable. What's going to happen? And then what future of the Democratic Party? You know, are you going to have another Gilded Age Democrat, or are you going to have something different? It's just like 1896. Thank you.
Well, I just, to make things more depressing, maybe just another historical fact, which is at least in the last Gilded Age, wages were rising for white workers in the West and in the Northeast, even though voting was declining. And I think it also bears reiterating the fact that those voting declines in the South, in particular, are related to a really vast white supremacist project to disenfranchise African Americans, which is done at the polls, and it's done through racial terror, and it's done through control of the press, and a whole range of different techniques. A lot in the presentation, and we thank Tom for that. But maybe we could start at the beginning. Maybe we could start at voter suppression, certainly, and voter disenfranchisement. Certainly something that is a subject of great concerns to Americans. Also, the question of voter turnout, weighs heavily in the way that we think about and have been interpreting the last presidential election and the last two election cycles, both presidential and midterm. So I'm wondering for the panelists on those kinds of issues, if we just sort of start there and don't take up the entire all of the slides that Tom helpfully shared with us, but if we get to those issues of voting suppression, voting disenfranchisement, what is the Gilded Age, the first Gilded Age, a good place to go back to think about the impact of those kinds of phenomena, the relevance of them for not just political inequality, but economic inequality, the connections between, if we had to be more specific about how we want to tease out connections between those two things or interrelationship between things that we conceive as distinct, but we're saying now we don't want our audience to think of them as distinct. Any sort of thoughts that folks would want to share on that?
I'll start. I mean, I think that, as Tom said, the story about the South is pretty straightforward, that it's massive disenfranchisement of African Americans and of quite frankly, whites as well, through a whole slew of different mechanisms, and it doesn't really recover until the 1950s or so, at least among whites and then subsequently among African Americans. But I think the interesting story is to think about what's happening outside of the South. And I think this is where you see really interesting regional differences. So Amy Bridges wrote this great book called Morning Glories, which talks about the creation of city governments and state governments in the West, in the Southwest. And these are governments, these are progressive era governments. These are governments that reflect the best of progressive era thinking in terms of really seeing politics and city government as the province of elites. And so these are city governments that are really created to depress turnout, fundamentally depress turnout through nonpartisan elections, through commission government, through all sorts of mechanisms which really don't invite or engage folks into local politics. I think if we were to switch and go, say, to Northeast or the Midwest, this is the battle between machine politics and, again, progressive era reformers who want to clean up municipal politics. And these progressive reformers, too, push for a number of quote-unquote reforms that also work to depress turnout and to really limit politics to reformers and other like-minded people. So I think that when we think about the mechanisms of voter suppression or lowered voter turnout, it's not just the South. It really is something that's happening and coming from progressive elites. Mm-hmm. I mean, the very people who I think in some ways we look to as people like us who will help reform the system. And they were reforming the system, but not necessarily for working class folks.
Right. So, yeah, that progressive project was a white supremacist project, and
It's elite.
yeah,
It's
yeah, and the sort of white supremacy protection is also a wealth protection. Jeff?
Oh, I'd just like to comment also on the same track here, where from the slide where we were seeing, Tom's slide, voter turnout, and then the big drop-off. What happens right before the big drop-off, right? In the late 1860s and the 1870s, at least in the eligible electorate, the party organizations were encompassing, right? And so what did it mean to mobilize an encompassing, landscape? And the party organizations were incredibly redistributive, right? In both political parties, right? Republican machines and Democratic machines were both highly redistributive, and the way in which they did it was through tapping public treasuries at the state level, at the city level, and then redistributing to a large extent, keeping a lot for themselves, right? Like I said before, party leaders become immensely wealthy in this period. They're never as wealthy as the great robber barons, right? They're not Vanderbilts, but they're Tweeds, right? But at the same time, the redistribution occurs through the spoils system, which we haven't really talked about yet, but is central to how political power is organized in the Gilded Age, in the period when we're talking about the voter turnouts much higher.
Can I just
Can
jump
I
in?
jump in to just say, to pull us back just a little bit to say that there's some important points of contact between the two periods and some important differences. One of the important differences, of course, was who was eligibly in the polity. And it's, the pre-1920 polity did not include women. There was a great deal of disenfranchisement during the first Gilded Age, most notably for African Americans, we've talked about, also for the white working class in cities. Now it's much more complicated. Another thing that's similar between the two periods is the two parties were really competitive with one another. We've been in periods in the United States where one party or the other is really the dominant one. Now, and during the first Gilded Age, the parties were really competitive. One difference is that the parties are much more ideologically distinct now than they were then. They were really, now they're offering voters a lot of choices on a lot of things, much more so than they did in the first Gilded Age. In another way, the parties in today are different, and I can see there are some people in the audience who actually know more about this than I do, but it is my understanding that during the first Gilded Age, the parties were much more mobilizing institutions than they are now. That the parties are strong in the legislatures now, but they don't have the strong links to ordinary citizens, getting them out to vote, organizing them, that in an era of candidate-centered campaigns, big money that comes through other forms other than parties, self-funded campaigns that are funded through campaign efforts of candidates, so that in a lot of ways there were two competitive periods of strong parties, but what it meant to be a strong party was quite different.
So can I just jump in? Because I think the point that you made about distributive systems is an important point. That is, you got something for being involved in local politics at the sort of ward or neighborhood level. And again, I think progressive reformers thought that this was corrupt and it was illegitimate, that parties should not be in charge of who gets what, that they, the experts, should be in charge of who gets what. And I think that a lot of progressive reform was really focused on how do we break the linkage between ordinary people and the party. That is, those who should be involved in politics should be the elite, hence nonpartisan elections, and not the sort of the precinct captain who was seen as fundamentally corrupt, but actually we now know played an important role in connecting people with parties.
Jeff?
Yeah, that's such a great point. I mean, go back and read what the civil service reformers were saying. It's all austerity politics. It would be completely, recognizable to everyone in the audience what they're saying, right? Reduce the number of public sector jobs, bring in business principles. This is the language, right? Break the party right to office that was at the crux of the spoils system. I mean, it's all about contracting yeah.
So it's incredibly important then to think about not just the question of voter access to the polls, suppression, suffrage, and all of that. That's incredibly important to think about. But there's also the issue of the institutions that mobilize voters, that give them the opportunity to deliberate, to express their voice, to shape policy and platforms. But surely parties, as different as they may have been, as more competitive, as they may have been in the last Gilded Age, certainly didn't generate in terms of economic equality, like far better outcomes than what we see today. Sort of the point of our comparison now is to say that, we're seeing similarities in outcomes. I also thought that we could talk a little bit more about other kinds of institutions that mobilize voters. Labor unions, farmers groups, temperance societies, a whole range of associations and institutions that mobilized voters and brought pressure to bear related to the issues of the day, some of which we don't see on the landscape in American politics, and some of which we see very different configurations, very different characteristics, very different relationships to the law and to regulation and the like. So I was just wondering if we could talk a little bit about that. And Kim Phillips-Fein, I thought maybe you could say a little bit, based upon your own research, about the differences between labor power and the power of big business, or the power of organized power of big business in the Gilded Age, the first versus today, and the intervening period. That you could maybe sketch that out a little bit for us.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about the dynamic, and certainly, I think that in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the labor movement is obviously has little, is formally very weak, and probably is not actually playing that much of a role in bringing people into electoral politics, but still, it just strikes me that one of the different, one of the differences between the two periods is the relative instability and openness and newness of all of these institutions, or the basic institutions of capitalism in the late 19th and early 20th century. That at that time, there is a way in which all of them, these large corporations, the financial sector, the modern political party, it all must have seemed as though it were open and plastic and flexible in a way that I think it is harder to conceptualize or imagine as such today. So anyway, that's not really about the power of labor unions, but it is one of the things that strikes me about the two periods. And then a second, related point is, I think the development of unions in the 30s and 40s and their growth to represent about a third of the population, workforce during the post-war years, does provide a very different kind of structure of mobilizing and getting people to the polls and to participate, as well as a new group of donors to political campaigns. And the attacks on unions and the reduction of the unionized workforce has also kind of reduced that capacity to mobilize people into politics. There's a little more to say about business organization, but maybe we can stay on labor right now and then talk about business organization in a few minutes.
Yeah, could I, let's begin with getting fundamental clarity here. In the Gilded Age, labor unions had a really tough time, except for a brief period during World War I, after which they were utterly destroyed in 1919, 1920. I don't think they ever reached more than about 7 or 8% of the total labor force. And if that sounds familiar, it's because it is. I mean, unions have they have shrunk from 1/3 to, I mean, counting public sector, you might get to 10 or so now, but some things just don't change. I have problems, though, with the suggestion that we are much more ideological now than we were in the Gilded Age. I think if you look, you see the following. Gilded Age party politics was exactly what the populists said it was, dominated by money politics in both parties. And they ran all the time on ethnic hatreds groups. If I quoted the definition of Massachusetts politics as the systematic organization of hatred, am I talking, 1980 or 1880? Well, that's Henry Adams, actually, from that earlier period. In that sense, anti-Catholicism, immigration, anti-black, you name it, every conceivable form of prejudice is going on in the Gilded Age. This stuff has been somewhat cleansed out of our history books. And in that sense, I would like to see a sort of tough-minded assessment of that with some quantitative data before I ascend it to that. What is fundamental is the fact that if you have two-party competition and both parties are dominated by money, you will have real competition in the sense, it's that investment theory of parties that I continually just push forward. The investment houses may or may not agree with the commercial banks or whatever, but they are going to agree on an awful lot. And you cannot run parties, you can't finance, you cannot bring an appeal to people unless you can finance it. And the sort of big change in American politics in the last 6 or 8 years is, what Sanders showed you, that you can actually do small donors in very large quantities. That is something that could change things. And small donor competition is very different from big donor competition. And you saw the graphs. These are just measurements. I didn't invent this stuff. It was true in the Gilded Age. It is true now.
Jeff?
Because the significance of money, or I would argue the significance of capital in the party system is so great, it is one of the silences between the parties. I mean, the parties organize themselves around a consensus on silences, too, in the way that, there was a consensus on silence around slavery in the antebellum period, right? So that's, I think, just a feature of party systems, but one of the things that I think we should see is, in the first Gilded Age, when you have a silence over the role of money in politics, because the party leaders are becoming very propertied, especially relative to their constituents, which is important, I think. One of the ways in which alliances are formed is through business deals, right? Make allies into business partners, make business partners into allies. I mean, it's incredible if you go and look at the boards of the railroads or the law firms that are doing a lot of the political business or the real estate brokerage firms. I mean, it's just, one of the things that's fascinating about Tammany Hall, for instance, in the 1870s and 1880s is it's just as much a real estate brokerage firm as it is a political organization. And that's because that's the way in which the alliances are made. So, you can make some interesting transactional short-term alliances through making each other wealthy. And that's one of the things that fascinates me most about, for instance, the fusion of the Trump organization in the contemporary moment with the modern administrative state. I'm kind of very, very curious the degree to which we don't really see what the alliances look like, what the political alliances look like in the way in which business opportunities and speculative opportunities are being distributed.
This goes back, I think, to a assumption that we have as Americans, or many of us have as Americans, rooted in the Gilded Age and the reaction to the Gilded Age, or the reform, quote unquote, of the progressive era, is the idea that if we can see it, okay, if we can't change it, we can't counteract it, but if we can see it, the sort of sunshine, the sunshine treatment of bringing the light in on what's festering and what's mildewing and what's corrupt and dirty, and that can help clean it up.
Yeah, if scholars had subpoena power, right? I mean, I think no, seriously, because a lot of politics takes place behind, you can't see it, right? I mean, the extent to which Supposedly Chester Arthur's last words, when he's dying on his deathbed, are to his sons, burn my papers, so no one can find out how the sausage was made. We don't really have the ability to see on the inside in a lot of cases, I think.
All right, so I'm going to have one there's so much more I want to ask you. I feel like I could sit with each of you for hours. But we want to leave plenty of time for the audience to ask questions. So let me try a kind of concluding. And Tom really helped me out by grouping the progressive era with the Gilded Age. So I'm going to take that and run with it and say, what do you think that reform attempts, like the reform attempts of the Gilded Age and progressive era that attempted to curb the political power of wealth particularly, what do you think we can take away or learn from them, whether it is a lesson about replicating or bringing back? Say, for example, the Sunshine Commission. Like, if we could just make things more transparent, that would go a long way. Or could it be that, there were huge mistakes that were made with that progressive reform agenda, which was the foundation for, New Deal liberalism and modern liberalism, and kind of cast this very long shadow on the left side of the mainstream political landscape of the United States, that you would say, listen, that was a departure point. This particular reform, quote unquote, of the progressive era was a departure point for a lot of the problems, the alliances between white supremacists and New Dealers, say, for example, to get a white heteronormative, pro-white male breadwinner welfare state. We got to go back and fix that. We can't just kind of take that as something that we want to hit rewind on. So whether it's a lesson for something that you want to see repeated or return to, or if it's sort of something that is an example of the kind of reform that we don't want or that we would want to rethink or completely revise, what does the historical perspective on the first Gilded Age and the progressive era that followed it, how does that inform your thinking about how we might curb the political power of wealth today? Or curb inequality, broadly speaking?
Well, not going back to the Gilded Age and the progressives.
Or maybe it doesn't, yeah.
My collaborators and I have written about this, and one of my collaborators is Henry Brady, who's the dean of the public policy school at Berkeley. And of course, he always thinks things can be fixed. He's paid to think that things can be fixed. But finally, we concluded our chapter, and this is not about substantive policy. This is not how can we make the Affordable Care Act work better. This is about procedural stuff. How can we make democracy work better? How can we reconcile economic inequality with the democratic promise that we are all equal as citizens, the level playing field that is one person, one vote? And our conclusion, alas, is that anything that would be either politically feasible or constitutionally feasible won't make much difference, and anything that would make a lot of difference is either politically infeasible or constitutionally proscribed. So I'm not the voice of optimism on this subject.
While maybe the panelists scratch their heads and think about whether they want to be the voice of optimism or not, I would invite everyone who has questions to begin lining up at the microphones in the front of the room, and we'll have, yes, go ahead. Okay.
So people who know me will be shocked that I'm actually going to be optimistic right now. But I think one of the things that Tom said, which is thinking about what is very similar about the Gilded Age then and now, is the anti-everything, right? Anti-immigration, anti-substance, all these various antis. And I think when we think about politics, people aren't, I don't think, necessarily motivated by my politicians getting a better deal with this ally than this other politician. I think they're motivated by, of course, other concerns. So I think one of the ways that perhaps we get out of the trap of this kind of lack of, I think the anti whatever movements are really based around a sense of lack of opportunity, that someone's getting something that I'm not getting. And I think that that you can only address the issue of money in politics by addressing the issue of lack of opportunity. I do think that if people feel that they have opportunity, however that's defined, then that then enables them to rein in money. I'm not sure if that'll work, but I'm trying to be optimistic here.
Kim, did you want to, you're looking at me like you're ready? No, okay. Any other thoughts?
Well,
Go ahead, yeah.
usually when I give talks, I tell people, sort of like Kay, if you want a happy ending, see a Disney movie. and then Tim Burton went to work for Disney, which sort of screwed that up too. But I would actually, for the first time in my life, I mean, look, I admit I go back to the Egyptian third dynasty or so. One of my children actually asked me a couple of decades ago, Dad, what was the first Gilded Age like? Because they'd heard the discussion at school, and I had to say, no, I didn't have any experience with that one. But look, the fact is, the spread. Some of my colleagues in INET, Lance Taylor, Servas Storm, Peter Teman's book on the declining middle class, I think puts it very well. The middle classes are declining. The enormous income inequalities are there, and they're growing. And wages for the bulk of the population are unlivable. This is very clear, and it's gotten worse. It's not getting better. And I do think that you can see clear electoral reactions to that. As I said earlier, I bet the socialist future, if you like, in the U.S. is probably in the cities, where you've got these huge numbers of people. They have college degrees. Many times they are, leveraged up to their eyeballs for loans. And yet, there was a case about 7 or 8 weeks ago, 1,000 journalistic jobs in the media disappeared in New York City and around in the space of about a week. That kind of thing is really happening. And in that sense, I think you can see the reaction. I don't know if it's enough. But if you told me that, say, I'm not pushing any particular candidate, and I'm certainly not talking for any institution that I'm related to, but if you told me that Bernie Sanders was going to make the kind of run he did in 2016, if you told me that in 2012, I would have said you were out of your mind. So I'm not so persuaded that things are completely hopeless, though I would add this. I don't actually think the issue is opportunity. I think what you learn from the Gilded Age is that after a certain point, outcomes really matter, meaning that it's not a question of everybody has an equal opportunity to be a billionaire. I don't think so, when the number of billionaires is that small. You actually need sort of genuine, you'll forgive my plain English for this, social democratic equality pervading the whole culture. You can't have these enormous extremes. They will translate into politics one way or the other.
So let's hear from our audience. Should we start? Take it away.
Thank you for speaking to us. It was a very enlightening program. My name is Roger Karlbach, a retired attorney. Got a theory that I appreciate your comments on, about the original intent interpretation of the Constitution. The original intent was that only rich people could vote. You needed to be a property owner, and property was largely land in the North and slaves in the South. And so when they have this fancy constitutional theory of interpretation of original intent, and they enact things like Citizens United, they're letting the rich, they can't amend the Constitution, but by giving the voice, the greater dollars of the rich people have more influence, they're trying to retrogress back to the time of 1789. That's my theory. I wonder what you think. Thank you.
Thanks. I mean, there's certainly no question that there was tension at the Constitutional Convention over the people's rule and the extent to which property owners should rule because they had a stake in the outcomes that the unproperty didn't, and so forth and so on. In fact, the Constitution, you're a lawyer, you know that the Constitution says almost nothing in the body of the Constitution about voting, and that where it says things about voting, it's time, place, and manner, that's it. Then in the amendment, extends the vote. It says states can't constrain the vote on the basis of sex, that sort of thing, you know. And they did that for 18-year-olds. There's stuff about the ways that African Americans were disenfranchised and so forth. That's what the Constitution has to say. So original intent, there's not much in the Constitution about voting. It was left to the states. I don't think there are a whole lot of people who, at this point, think that we should go back to constitutional intent and leave women out of the electorate. I mean, that might be controversial, but I don't know. So it's probably, this is probably not the area in which a conversation about original intent is going to be the most fruitful.
Well, I was just going to say, yeah, I agree with your hypothesis, and I think that we don't even need to hypothesize because there's good books out there like Nancy McLean's book and Stephen Tellis's book about the history of constitutional originalism, and it's very much intended to be a technique, you know, kind of legal school that is intended to insulate wealth, existing wealth, the possibility of accumulating more wealth from the demands of democratic majorities who would, you know, use taxing power and, you know, seek to expand social welfare from the public purse, not just in this country, but in other countries as well. And, you know, I mean, there's a whole kind of libertarian political philosophy gloss around this about protecting the rights of minorities. But, I mean, it's really against the will of the majority, but it's really about insulating property. So, you know, in that sense, it is going back to classical liberalism and the world that the founders lived in. But on the other hand, the idea that the property rights and the political rights of human beings, property owners, albeit that may be the case, would be transferred to corporate bodies that are like kind of immortal institutions for solidifying and accumulating wealth and exercising political power based upon that wealth. I mean, by the same token, even if you wanted to think in originalist terms or the terms of the founders' worldview, like that would mortify them. You know, that would be completely anathema. So, I mean, I think on both grounds, in terms of like a real understanding of the political worldview of the founding fathers and how they thought about the role of wealth and democracy, and in terms of like empirical what were the originalists trying to achieve by developing that jurisprudence. You know, I agree with your hypothesis.
Could I, just one quick comment. Let's not get carried away. I had to be at a predominantly, let us say, right-wing conference very recently, and it is clear there that majority opinion on a good chunk of the right is now the things like the relationship between capitalism and democracy is coming under very sharp scrutiny. And one speaker bravely got up and said, no, we have to be committed to democracy. Lots of people just disagreed with that. In general, there's also an active movement to get rid of direct election of U.S. senators. Now, I mean, in general, Nancy McLean's book on James Buchanan, and I think Democracy in Chains, and the sort of efforts to build in, if you like, strengthen constitutional provisions for supermajorities, is quite worth a read. The sort of general critique of constitutionalism is far more powerful out there than you might learn from New York City, because you won't run into too many of these people, and if you do, they meet, you know, in some special room and you're not invited. But this is quite a show, and it is now around not just in the U.S., but it's remarkable.
And would just with reference to the old Gilded Age, I mean, there is a pretty strong movement by by elites in the Gilded Age to try to, bring back the disenfranchisement of unpropertied voters. And the first Gilded Age is a period, as we were saying before, of, really remarkable disenfranchisement, and both in terms of literally the vote, but other types of suppression of political power and political participation. So, I always say to my students, the arc that bends towards justice can run in reverse under a constitutional government. History teaches us this.
Look, just one comment on there's one of the greatest quotes of all time, if you want to understand the Gilded Age political reform movements. It's in the old Miller and Cochran book on the business history of the United States. It's one of Samuel Tilden, who ran and got kind of counted out in 1876 for the presidency. His interlocutor says to him, what we need in office, he's rich, that guy, what we need in office are people who will not steal, but who will let us steal. He says it just like that. And Tilden's nickname was the Great Forecloser. His mansion's quite spectacular. It's now the National Arts Club here. It's a beautiful building. He was a bank Democrat.
We should let our audience talk. Sorry, go ahead.
Hi, I'm William. I'm a doctoral student here at the GC in art history. Thanks, Professor Ferguson, and the whole panel for your wonderful conversation, but those charts is going to remain with me for quite a while. Thank you. Visual display of quantitative information is wonderful. I know this has been a very domestic conversation so far and very political, but would you guys care to comment on the international economic context of the first and second Gilded Ages? Because in the latter part of the 19th century, the U.S. was the rising international economic colossus, but it was still in the world dominated by European imperial forces. And now, we, of course, once again, are dominant power in the international economic system. But I do note that, for instance, Adelson gets most of his money from his 2 gigantic casinos in Macau, and our European brethren are far more willing to fine and punish Google and Facebook to the extent that we can't even yet imagine in the United States. So I don't know whether there's an international economic context between the first and second that's worth talking about, especially this attitude towards big money today. Thank you.
Yes.
I think that's a really great question. So the other side of this moment is that it's American imperialism, that we get these sort of quote-unquote insular possessions, we intervene in Puerto Rico and Dominican Republic. There's a lot going on for the U.S. And I think one of the things I think about is this great essay by Frederick Jackson Turner called The End of the Frontier. It's a really interesting essay because I think it speaks to the anxieties both then and now, at least in terms of the U.S., about what is the role of the U.S., what is the role of opportunity. And for the U.S., one of the issues is that we no longer have the West. And so we need to sort of go out and kind of secure our place in the world. And I think that kind of anxiety about where is the U.S.'s place in the world is with us today. I think perhaps in the first Gilded Age, it was maybe a sense of optimism. And I think probably today is probably more of a sense of pessimism, of losing a sort of sense of I think really of the sense that the American century has really come to an end.
Well, I make one comment. I think the basic difference is this. In the Gilded Age, exactly as you just suggested, there was a lot of emphasis on let's go get our place out there with the other. In that respect, it was a common assumption. Whether or not it was true or not is, I think, a very interesting question. But somehow you'd be a big winner out of, for purposes of plain speaking, and imperialism would make you money. I think that presumption is gone in most of the United States now. Most people, if you're not a member of Davos man or Davos woman, is there equal opportunity in that regard? Lots of minutes of this stuff has been published now. Then all these, what might be called the overhead costs of the American empire look like a losing bet for you. And that attitude is I think, not going to dissolve anytime soon. There are a bunch of exceptions to that, and people with interest in particular places, yeah. But the bulk of the population, I think, is now not thinking that if we got more involved in, you name the continent, that it would be wonderful for the United States. That's a big difference.
Yes. The framers of the Constitution only wanted people who were property to vote. They didn't trust other people. They were afraid of mob rule. But they formed a democracy, but they really didn't really want a democracy. And over the years, now that everyone has the franchise, it's interesting that the Republicans use the mob now to help them. Originally, they didn't want the mob to vote, but now the Republicans, by conning many people who are ignorant or have prejudices or are gullible, to vote against their own best interests, in other words, to vote for Republicans. So it's interesting that the mob is being used by them. And the greatest problem moving forward that I can see is are uneducated, ignorant, gullible people, and that the effort has to be made in educating, and not just in schools, but by wherever we can, especially politicians running for office. The first job is to educate. A lot of what goes on here is talking to the choir. There has to be some way to reach people who don't know that they're voting against their own best interests and making responsible for their own anger because they're making things worse. And that the majority of people in the country, the vast majority of people, have much more in common than not.
So I'm going to just say one little thing to that, not because I completely disagree with what you're saying, but I think there's a real danger here, and I think that Trump's election embodies it in the following sense. So American voters voted for Trump, whether they were voting against Hillary Clinton, for Republicans, against the Democratic Party. I mean, that's a more complicated issue. Like, what were they exactly fighting or voting for, right? So that would be the first thing I say. The second thing I would say with respect to the history that we've been referencing today is that, like, yeah, you can try as a kind of a wealthy, elitist, demagogue, corrupt, power-grabbing person, you can try to tap into the anger of the mob, and you can even try to, you can try to spark it, you can try to corral it, but you can't do that forever. And you can't do it, it's not going to behave predictably in the ways that you want, I think, over time. So that's going to require like a constant effort on your part. So going back to the example of the South that we were talking about earlier, like, yes, it took a lot of effort, including disenfranchising poor white people, to generate those voter disenfranchisement that we looked at before. Because what the autocrat enclave rulers, and I'm referencing a political scientist I really like named Robert Mickey, what they knew was that you could not, race was not something to take for granted, and racism wasn't something to take for granted. Even among the people, poor whites in the South, who, you would think would be most primed to those kinds of dog whistles and those kinds of suggestions. There are going to be times that they do understand, even if they don't want to marry, even if they don't want to live in the same neighborhoods, even if they get other kinds of satisfactions from segregation. They're going to understand that sometimes common cause across the color line is going to be in their self-interest. So it's not enough to just whip them up and spew hateful things. You're actually going to have to also disenfranchise them too. Okay, because you can't just control that and expect that you can push the button and it'll always go in the way that you want it to go. So I don't know that that's hopeful, exactly, but I think it's to say that you can't lecture to people about what their own self-interests are. I think that is the kind of elite, academic, lefty, progressive challenge of the moment right now is, we can't just lecture to people about what their interests are and why they're not voting according to their interests.
I could add to that I vote against my economic self-interest, and probably I'm not the only person in this room who so does.
I also want to push back against this notion of some people being ignorant or conned. and voting against their own interests. I mean, I think people's interests are multifaceted, and that I think there is a tendency, particularly I think among the progressive/left, that interests can be sort of reduced down to material or economic, on a sort of an economic scale. And I think that, you know, if you think about the great movements of the past, like the temperance movement, I mean, that's really an enormous amount of political passion and political activity, not around economics, but really around sort of a belief about how society ought to be run. And so I think that one of the things that we have to understand is that politics has to speak to the ways in which people want to see the world. And that we might think it might be social democracy, but they might think that it's something else. And the way I think that we need to go forward is to figure out a way to speak to people that maybe calls to the good as opposed to the bad, but not necessarily say, well, because you voted against your economic interests, therefore you voted the wrong way. I mean, I don't agree with the way they voted, but I think that we need to sort of figure out a way to sort of tap into sort of non-economic ways in which people want to see the world. Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to assume that our conveners will cut us off when it's really timed. Okay, good.
Go ahead.
Louis Friedman, I'm a retired faculty member at CUNY. I was wondering if the comparison to the past has distorted our view of the political system in the future. There are no national political parties that could control access to running for office, as we realize. Anybody could run, and if they have the money as well. But more importantly, in terms of the chart that was so dramatic for people, Bernie Sanders raised his money over the internet. And we really haven't talked about what social media and the internet has consequence on elections or politics, or we know a little bit about society, but certainly Bernie Sanders could not have raised that money from small donors in 1976 or 82 or 80 or 84. So do you agree with that, and what do you think that really means for the future?
Is that? Well, look, it's obvious that it would have been harder to raise the money if you didn't have the internet. Now, there were repeated efforts to change various forces in the internet, even in the years just ahead of that 2016 race. Lots of congressmen and women actually had discussions about network neutrality, and that was something of an issue. In the end, you know, you still got it and it works. Now, that's of course not the only effect of the internet. There is a vast discussion underway about all the other effects of the internet. And there is what I regard as a just hyperbolic, quite mistaken view. I'm actually trying to test this empirically right now with American National Election Survey data. But like, I didn't think that the American election was really tipped by the Russians. And what my colleagues and I, when we wrote a paper on the 2016 election, Ben Page and I wrote it, and it's out on the INET website. Well, and the one thing we do discover is that the big impact on your voting is probably not what I mean, I ran a Facebook thing on it, didn't work, but maybe there's a better way to do it. But whether you had a Senate race in your state, the assumption there being a lot of money really mattered that came in extra. That's whatever. The question is, I think the question about social media's impact on elections is at the moment open, but it's clear you can raise funds with it. So the answer is, I agree with you without trying to make a clear statement about the net effect. Yeah, that's right, yeah. But you had fake news long ago. I mean, I am always struck by the Jacksonian period when there were thousands and thousands of newspapers. And if you read, I mean, I actually, when I try to think about the internet, I usually think about that period. And one point Goodwin made in his populism book is the first thing the populists had to do was go build their own press, because the regular press just did fake news. Look sometime at 1896 at the New York Times coverage of William Jennings Bryan. I've actually done it, and he more or less has horns. I mean, that was fake news. Fake news is much older than the internet.
Let me chime in to say that I too believe that social media and so forth are having an impact on our politics in many ways, and we don't quite know where it's going. One thing we do have data about are data that compare people who participate online and people who participate offline. And at the time that the internet was born, the sort of engineer types were very optimistic that this was going to open up our politics. And they also said that that the discourse was going to really be civil. We know how that turned out. But in terms of, is it generating participation by people who would not otherwise participate? The answer is, when it comes to income, no. That the people, that for all the things you can do either online or offline, so you can make the good comparison, the groups don't look very different or different at all. There are some codicils to that I want to say. The first is, we've been talking about small donors, and small amounts of money are really important in our politics because they can't have the kind of clout that these really big, deep, millions of dollars from the same source can. On the other hand, those small donations are coming from upper middle class people. They are not coming from the vast middle class. And the ceiling of $200 is a lot of money in this day and age to a very vast part of the American electorate. So when you talk about small donations, you are democratizing the giving in one way, but not as much as you think you might be sort of bringing in new kinds of voices. The one way in which online participation does change things is that, at least when we looked, starting a decade ago and then 4 or 5 years ago, the group that participated online was not as old as the offline donors. So it does help democratize the election when it comes to age, but not when it comes to income.
Yeah, so fascinating panel, thank you very much. And we have first Gilded Age and second Gilded Age, and presumably a period in between that's not gilded, I suppose. And we talked a lot about whether we should be optimistic or not. That emergence from the first Gilded Age that left our democracy mostly intact, what lessons can we learn from that transition that maybe we could apply to 2028 or something like that? Or 24 or 20 or, whatever next week. So, as a historian, when you take a look at the end of that moment in our history and the beginning of the middle of the century, what do you think are principal components that led to America undertaking that transition successfully?
Say that last part again, I'm sorry.
What are the principal components that led to the transition out of the first Gilded Age to a sort of more...
Not quite so gilded.
Yeah, ungilded period,
Bronze
exactly, right? A
age,
bronze
sure.
period, exactly.
Silver-plated age.
The tarnished age, perhaps. There we go.
Can I make a brief comment on that? Or did I jump in front of someone? I just very briefly, I'd posit that, if you have a financialized economy, then you have a financialized political system. And you can't unwind the two unless you're going to move out of financialization.
My more pessimistic turn, and I'm actually now going to be pessimistic, is you have a hot war and a cold war, which leads to that moment that Katie calls the Great Moderation, right? That really freezes politics in a certain kind of way. So I think that the beginning of the second Gilded Age is that moment that sort of Great Moderation, that freezing of stuff kind of ends. And then we end up looking, in some ways, more like the first Gilded Age in terms of having a much different media landscape. That the Great Moderation was a moment where the media landscape was really dominated by these kind of a very small number of actors. You have an economic system that's dominated by these sort of large corporations. Now, not so much. So I think that, I'm not sure where we go, but certainly I think how we got out of the first Gilded Age, I don't think we should probably go that route to get out of the second Gilded Age. But other than that, I don't really have anything more optimistic to say.
Social movements is another, I don't think it's a deus ex machina thing. I mean, I think it's it has to do with the power of mobilized citizens in social movements. So, I mean, I date the Gilded Age a little bit differently than Tom does, and I'd say, between the radicalism around, demands to abolish the gold standard into the First World War and the Russian Revolution, all the way through the 40s, 30s, and into the 40s and even the 50s before the Cold War really sets in, mobilized radical social movements, they move the center of American politics and they move the left in particular. So, I think without that kind of pressure and that kind of imagination and grasping of possibility of things that, talking about Tom was saying before, I wouldn't have predicted in 2012 that what we saw in 2016 would get to happen. I mean, without that hard work of moving the conversation and putting pressure, building pressure, that to me is the most important lesson that history shows.
Could I just comment? I think policy failure is the thing that ended the Gilded Age. That is to say, it's very clear the Depression and the financial crises that came with that wrecked the whole show. And that's the big opening. Gilded Age billionaires, if you like, nobody is as good as they are at destroying their edifice. And I fear you're sort of looking around for something like that. Now, they had a big crisis. It should have, resulted in something better. We all know we elected Obama, who did not come through with a New Deal. I actually think the people who voted for Trump, especially the poorer voters, very clearly were voting against the fact that the prosperity didn't reach them. And where you sit now in the United States is, it's not like folks who are talking to you in politics in the newspapers or on TV actually have anything that works very well, except we can, all debate later about AOC and things like that. I like many of those proposals. But none of the major party stuff that people are talking about is going to actually fix the sort of gradual spread of this dual economy and the collapse of the middle class. That is going to generate mass movements and people thinking and writing. It's already happening. I don't know if it'll be enough.
All right, we're going to take one last quick question, okay?
Hi there. My name is Jorgen. I'm visiting from Denmark, and it's very interesting kind of listening to this Gilded Age. As I see a big difference, and we're seeing this in Europe as well as an age of is that here in the second Gilded Age, there's the perception of failure to deliver on promises. Like you were just saying, everybody thought Obama would make a New Deal. And I feel nobody's addressing that. Nobody from the Democratic Party, and we're seeing in Europe, are saying, we screwed up, we didn't deliver, we understand why you went to the other side. Why do you think that isn't happening?
Well, what's the matter with money-driven politics? I've actually looked at the continental data. I just gave a speech in Berlin a couple months ago, looking at about 15 countries and examining various papers by other people, because there is an argument out by Barry Eichengreen and Moritz Schulrich and people like that people instinctively vote right in financial collapses. None of that, I think, is true. But if you're trying to figure out how left-wing or center-left parties that should have been more left than center, they're not going to ever critique. What I discovered when I was working through the archives in the New Deal is a pretty interesting situation in the American Federation of Labor. It's a story I have not related yet in print. They had a bank that failed, and a number of the top officers were involved in it. So a bunch of people from General Electric, GM, and others, they all recapitalized that bank for those people right in the middle of the Depression. If you're trying to explain why did the why did the AFL never move, that is a very good part of that type of clientelism works. You had to have the CIO. The labor movement had a split in order to get something to happen. I think that kind of stuff may just have to happen again.
Let me just say one thing too before I let us all off the hook. I think we have to take, sort of as middle class, insofar as this is at all representational, or at least professionals up on the stage. Middle and professional classes have to bear their part of the responsibility too. So if you look at the United States in comparison to Scandinavian, Nordic countries or whatever, a lot of social policy is really very much disguised and hidden in the tax code, right? So, you don't, as a middle class homeowner, the education system, health insurance, like all of this kind of stuff, like, we middle class people, professional people get it because, they are able to retain money that they've earned rather than paying it out in taxes, right? So when we talk about making the kinds of programs and proposals that now we are seeing on the left in the American political landscape, and all of these questions come up about how are we going to pay for it, how are we going to pay for it, how are we going to pay for it, and there's lots of different answers, and I'm not trying to suggest what the right one is, but at some point, one of the problems, I think, is apart from like, okay, the big donor class doesn't like those ideas, there's also the idea that we have to really remember, or the reality that we have to remember, which is that, Americans don't want to give up any of those entitlements either, right? So, insofar as that kind of voter needs to make a choice about, like, yes, I do want Medicare for all versus my private health insurance that I that I complain about, but then, I don't want my tax incentive to go away, or my tax credit or whatever to go away for those kind of, those tax expenditure, I wouldn't want to start to not be able to deduct my interest payment or whatever it is, right? Like, so insofar as middle class folks would have to give up that stuff, it makes it very politically tricky. The problem, of course, is that over time, in this financialized political economy, like that system of tax expenditures is increasingly benefiting the richest, and over time benefiting the middle class less and less. And so then there's an issue, going back to the issue of like true economic interests, where people don't kind of see that, like, well, yeah, you can put away your money and not pay taxes to educate your child, but, college tuition has gone off the roof. So what's the point anyway? Like, that tax preference isn't even helping you, right? Or, sure, I like having capital gains income tax preference. The money that I make off my investments is taxed less, and I can do things with that. But then at the same time, most people who get most of the benefit of that are colossally wealthy. So yes, I'd have to give something up, right, to for the government to have more resources. And that's, I think, hard to ask even middle class and professional people to do. So it's not just about the big bad rich people. It's also about, more middle income people thinking about the expenditures.
Okay, thank you so very much. Let's give our panelists one more round of applause.